So tonight, I'm really excited. I'm a Fairfield alum. I did my grad work there. And when we had an alumni college recently, there were a few classes in different disciplines that were offered. And one of the music classes, well, the only music class that particular day, was Brian Torff, who's a professor of music at Fairfield U and also a very accomplished musician himself. In fact, he was on NBC at CBS at Christmas time. And he will be performing here on April 22nd, I believe. You could check the schedule, but he will be performing here. I thank you for doing that. Yeah. But tonight, he's here to present the Essential American Songs class. This was actually the class that was taught to the alums at Fairfield U, and you're getting it tonight for free, no tuition involved. And the expertise of Brian Torff, I'm really excited. Let's give him a round. Thank you. Oh, can everyone shut their phones off, please?
That's right, because we're all on television, and you're going to be big stars by the end of the night.
By TCTV tonight as well.
Welcome, everybody, and good evening. So glad you're here. It's kind of cold out. Let's get the vibe a little warmer. I'd like everybody to stand up, and we're going to play blues together. And you're going to help me, because I need all the help I can get. Just keep that going. Sounds great. Pretty good. You're ready to join my band. Have a seat. Good evening. We just played the blues, and the blues is the foundation of American music. Without that, we don't have rock and roll. We don't have hip-hop. We don't have jazz. We don't have anything. And it's all ours. And that's what's amazing about this country, is that we have evolved so many incredible musical styles. You think about it, and it just seems almost limitless the last 100 years or so. So why us? Why not Europe? Why not other countries that are much, much older than ours? What is it about America that seems to be just such fertile soil for so many creative musical forms? So tonight, what I would like to do with you is kind of take you through a number of songs that I picked out. They're not necessarily the best songs. They're not necessarily the most popular songs, but they are songs to me that were catalysts. In other words, they seem to evoke change. They push the envelope. They made a difference. So I always have to point out to my students, my undergrad students, there's a difference between music that's popular and music that becomes art. Now, many times, music that starts out being popular, great, but only time will tell whether it ends up being art or not. Sometimes it's a hit and it goes away. So I think really almost all the songs I'm going to present for you today are those kind of things that grow over a period of time. So we're going to go right to back to the very beginning, and we're going to look at some really older American music, because that's the soil, that's the foundation on which we're built on, and we'll see where our journey takes us. All right, so you may not know this guy. He was a tap dancer, and his name was William Henry Lane, and he was known as Master Juba. He was a black man who was actually a superstar in the middle 1800s, which is very unusual for an African American. You all know what tap dance is, right? I'm not about to tap dance for you, so don't get scared, because that would be ugly, okay? But that's an African American invention. And do you know why? You know why tap dancing? Because they outlawed the drums in the South. When they outlawed the drums, because slaves were escaping, where did the rhythms go? They went from the drum to the human body, okay? And so what William Lane did was he created rhythms by using his feet, his hands, and making his total body a percussion instrument. And so this rhythm is known as Pat and Juba, and it goes like this. So the way people in the South used to do it is kind of like this. Okay? So what that enabled slaves to do was take the African drum and the rhythms that came to America and now incorporate it in the human body, and thus the beats continue to evolve. Africans came to this country with a tremendous sense of what we call cultural memory. You can enslave someone, you can change their name, you can sell off their family, but you cannot take away their culture. Their culture is so embedded in them that that's going to come out no matter what is going on in the world and no matter what tyranny is happening around them. And so William Henry Lane was really an example of the indomitable spirit of American music. And those beats, that beats that I just played for you, to me when I hear that, it sounds like New Orleans funk. It sounds like the Meters or the Neville Brothers or groups like that, because that's exactly what they do today. So William Lane is a great example of that. We're going to go to a folk singer now, Richie Havens. Once the church separated races. In the beginning, when slavery happened in 1619, Africans were now in white churches, and they were learning how to sing psalms and hymns, and they were learning the prayer book, and they were learning English. Then, of course, they got the idea that this didn't make any sense to them. They started to escape, and pretty soon you had the white churches saying, we're not going to have African Americans in here anymore because they want freedom, they want these crazy ideas, and so they can have their own church. Once they formed their own church, what you had was what we call syncretism. Syncretism is when you take two separate things and you put them together, and it becomes something new. So now what you had was, think about the dates. 1619 slaves come over here, okay? We're talking about 1782. I think the first black church is in Savannah, Georgia. It's an amazing building. They're big holes in wooden floors where slaves hid on the Underground Railroad. So now what you have is African Americans now forming their own church, but they're going to do a hybrid, a syncretism of the European hymns and psalms they've been learning for over 100 years now, and they're going to mix it with that syncopated rhythm, you see. And once you get those two things together, you now have an original American musical form. The first one after, I think, Native American music, and it's called the spirituals. Everybody knows the spirituals. Everybody sings Amazing Grace or Michael Row the Boat Ashore or something like that. This is a rendition I love by Richie Havens, the late Richie Havens, one of the great folk singers of the 60s. And listen to the words, because the words tell a story.
Follow the drinking gold. Follow the drinking gold. For the old man is coming just to carry the freedom. Follow the drinking gold. When the sun comes back and the first quail calls, follow the drinking gold. For the old man is waiting just to carry the freedom. Follow the drinking gourd. Follow the drinking gourd. Follow the drinking gourd. For the old man is waiting to carry the freedom. Follow the drinking gourd.
Now I ask my students, don't tell me what it sounds like, tell me what does it mean. What is the song for? That's what Pete Seeger used to say. Don't ask the question in folk music, how good is the song? Ask the question, what is the song good for? What can it achieve? What's it about? It's an escape route, right? Okay, so follow the drinking gourd is then following the Big Dipper, just like wading in the water is a tip to say bloodhounds can't follow your scent when you are in water, okay? So what spirituals did then was it put freedom on two different levels. One was the freedom of the afterlife, and hopefully a better life for anyone who is enslaved. But it also said freedom is now, and freedom is possible if we seek it. But you couldn't make an announcement about it. You know, that would be the end of your life. And so the only way you could do it was as a coded message. And I always say, I think that music is more compelling than speeches. You know, yes, people will go and listen to a politician speak. Maybe not for very long anymore, but they will listen. They will go about. They will thousands will go and listen to people sing songs that are meaningful to them. So I think from the very beginning, American music reestablishes itself as, yes, it's fun, it's entertainment, it's dance, and we love to sing along, but it does more than that. It provides a voice to people who oftentimes really don't have a voice, but yet they continue on anyway. Okay, so now we get to a very interesting American, and you probably know the name Scott Joplin. Scott Joplin is synonymous with ragtime. Now we're at the turn of the century, early 1900s. The piano is the most popular instrument in the world. Okay, the guitar doesn't really become popular until the 1940s when it's electrified. People play the guitar, but it wasn't very loud, and it wasn't very impressive in band music. Everybody had a piano in their parlor. It was like having a television set in the 1950s. You had to have one. Joplin was an interesting man because he was obviously a black man who came from a different kind of background. His mother had been a banjoist in the minstrel shows, black-faced minstrel shows, and he was given the opportunity to not only read and write, which was unusual for a black man at this time, young boy at this time, but he also studied classical music. So he could read and write music, which was very unusual for an African American at this time. He didn't invent ragtime, okay, but he was the most famous of the ragtime composers because what is ragtime? And a good thing it's not a piano here because if I demonstrate it'd be awful. Okay, but ragtime is basically splitting two continents in two hands, meaning the left hand is basically Europe. When Joplin plays Maple Leaf Rag, as you'll hear in a minute, it's right on the beat. Boom, 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 boom. But that's not what the right hand does. The right hand, like a banjo in a minstrel show, plays. Now that's Africa and Europe colliding on the keyboard. Make sense? Okay? You wouldn't think it would work. You would think it'd be a total clash. It would be two different styles. Well, it wouldn't work. But the fact is, that's what syncretism is. Syncretism says it does work. This is now, it's not Africa and it's not Europe. This is America. This is what America sounds like at the turn of the century. So you hear Scott Joplin, and you can just imagine people doing the cakewalk, which was the dance that they did at the end of the minstrel shows, to try to take the cake. The best couple won the cake. So with this, as I play it for you, I want you to imagine, if you can, that the left hand, and this is Joplin playing a piano roll, is in the bass playing right on the beat, and the right hand is playing a syncopated rhythm that you would hear a banjo player play in any kind of minstrel show song. And you all know this piece. Oops, not that one, this one. Do you hear that? Bum, 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 potato, do that, da 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 da. Okay? So many people would say that's probably the beginning of jazz, even though Joplin's not improvising. He's written down every single note. But it's inferring that the new world, the new America of the 20th century will now break away from Europe. It won't be about the waltz and the gavotte and the minuet and all these dances that have been brought over from Europe. It'll be about the cakewalk. It'll be about dances that enrage your parents. You see what I mean? In other words, the cakewalk will represent a rebellion, a breaking away, long before Elvis Presley, long before that was even a notion, right? Okay, so on with the rebellion. How we go with a real genius of the 20th century. I remember Dizzy Gillespie saying once about Louis Armstrong, know him, know me. Meaning that this guy is the father of jazz and the father of our improvised language. And Miles Davis said, there's nothing you can play on the horn that Louis Armstrong hasn't already played. He was from a destitute background in New Orleans. You'd think this guy's going to end up being a gangster or dead by the time he's 15 years old. And this is the American dream personified, right? Because he gets in trouble, they put him in the home for colored waifs, and they give him a bugle. And if that ever was an argument for how important music is in our schools, this is the guy right here. You know, it took him off the streets and made him a legend. It made him one of the most famous people of the 20th century. What is so great about Louis Armstrong? Everything. Great entertainer, incredible virtuoso player. He changed the times. He didn't just change the trumpet, he changed the times. The way we move on the dance floor changed as a result of Louis Armstrong. He brought races together just by the sheer power of his music. I remember the great writer Ralph Ellison saying, Louis Armstrong came to his town in Oklahoma City, and he said there were all these young white women who came to see Louis Armstrong in addition to the African Americans, and they weren't supposed to be there because it was very strict, separate but equal back then. And he said that was their music too, and they were willing to break the law to get to it. So what Armstrong really was, without making a big speech, he wasn't that kind of guy, he was a unifier. And what he taught us was, and I wish I had a rubber band on because this is the time in my class where I always have a rubber band. I go, Armstrong taught us to do this. Okay? Africans are incredible rhythmic players, but they don't swing. Europeans who play, brass band music are great at that, but they do not swing. What Armstrong taught us to do was to play in time, but to be able to suspend the time, make it faster or slower within the beat. I always say the visual analogy is, I'm a Chicago guy, Michael Jordan going to the hoop and hanging in midair and suspending himself. And that to me is the sound of Louis Armstrong. So what he taught us was how to swing. And swing is a musical idea, but it's also, I think it's a worldview. It's a metaphor for life. It basically means, we're here and let's, as Ralph Ellison said so beautifully, the secret of the game is to make life swing. Louis Armstrong. He was so far ahead of his time that I think it took a generation of players to catch up with him. On that record, everybody in the background is going like this. Dit, 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 dit. And he's going, ba, 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 da, 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 da. He's not going, ta, 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 da, da. He's doing something else. Just like to me, Michael Jordan was doing something else, and everybody else had to catch up with what that reality truly was. That photo on the right, of course, is a Victrola. I have a 1929 Victrola, and I always bring it in my class, and I say, if you were 18 years old, this is what music would have sounded like to you in 1929, coming through the little speaker there on the tone arm. But that Victrola is huge. It's as big back at that day as the smartphone is today. Why? Because it was a disseminator of American music throughout the country and around the world, okay? And it brought races together in the parlor before they actually got there physically. You see what I mean? So now you could buy a race record of Louis Armstrong or the next person I'm going to play, Bessie Smith, the legendary Bessie Smith, the Empress of the Blues, and you could bring it into your house and suddenly you had a different home than you had before. Who was Bessie Smith? Well, this is a woman who was so far ahead of her time, it's almost shocking. She was the best-selling blues singer of the 1920s. Women were far more impactful blues singers in the 20s than men were. Bessie Smith was outspoken, Her famous story was she scared the Ku Klux Klan away from one of her engagements all by herself, and they ran. And she was an example of the voice of the field worker in the 17 and 1800s. Remember, if you were a field worker, you could sing, but you couldn't speak. If you spoke, you'd be whipped or worse, because if you spoke, you're up to no good. But you could sing. And so what people did in the fields in the South is sing call and response back to each other, you know. And so when they sang, and this is an important point, generally Europeans sing the well-tempered scale, right? The do, re, mi. Do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do. This is not the way Africans sing. Africans do not sing in that system. They don't sing the note, they bend the note. So once again, it's like the rubber band. And so therefore, they sing glissandos and growls and slides that you can't play on the piano. To this day, you can't play them on the piano. So therefore, when you listen to Bessie Smith, listen to the way she doesn't just sing the note, she bends from one note to another. And that, of course, is our style of popular singing, from her to Sinatra to whoever is popular today. You hear the way she bends that note? Now that's huge. I'll tell you why that's huge, because what it means is Americans now, I don't care what their race is, are going to pick up, particularly post-Civil War, European instruments that are in hock shops that are available for about $1. They're on battlefields before. And so you can pick up a clarinet or an old cornet or whatever happens to be for next to nothing. But the American player is going to take European instruments and play them in a different way, with a different kind of accent. So I started out tonight with my little harmonica thing, and a harmonica is a German instrument, it's not American. And it came to this country about the middle 1800s. And it was very popular both for the North and the South during the Civil War. But there was a difference between the white soldiers, the way they played it, and the black soldiers. The white soldiers basically played it relatively straight, like the Irish or Scottish folk songs they sung. So if you breathe into it, you get something out of a harmonica. But the black soldiers didn't do that, from what a number of letters say. They bent the note like this. That's a whole other thing, you know. Well, that's exactly what Louis Armstrong does on the trumpet. That's what Bessie Smith does with her voice. That's what everybody's going to do in American popular music, is they're going to take the voice from the fields and the church and now put them through European instruments. But European instruments are now going to get a totally different kind of voice than they ever had before. What I played for you was classic blues. That's what Bessie Smith did. What this guy did, Robert Johnson, was he played Delta blues. Delta blues was exactly what you played out on a lonesome crossroads in the middle of nowhere, because there was no music store, no instruments, no nothing. So the guitar, and you know how the guitar got popular in America? You can use this at your next cocktail party and say you thought of it. Sears Roebuck. Sears Roebuck in the 1920s came out with the first mail order catalog, and they advertised that guitar that you see there, and that guitar is called the Stella. And the Stella, I think, was maybe about $12, which was a lot of money back then. You had to save for that. But what it did was it made you a one-man or one-woman band. So the sound of Delta blues then was, the call and response now is between the voice and the guitar. And we don't know a lot about Robert Johnson. He's one of the phantoms of American music, but we do know that he was writing songs that were dark. They were about the devil. They were about having a hellhound on his trail. He wrote about, this is what's really like for black people in the South during the 1930s. And he was a big, big influence on Bob Dylan, among many, many others. This is his famous Crossroad Blues. He was a visionary, and a visionary is basically someone who is not just popular, and this is, I think, an important point, they create a form. They create a form and a blueprint that anyone else then can pick up and then find what they can do with it, what kind of music they can make with it. So in order to have Robert Johnson in the 1938, he died at the age of 27, now in the 1940s, you've got people like T-Bone Walker picking up the electric guitar and B.B. King, and now they're playing modern Robert Johnson. You see what I mean? They're taking it now to the next step. So he was a guy who, you know, like so many of the people I'm talking about tonight, really was ahead of his time. This is an important musician in American life, Woody Guthrie. And Woody Guthrie, of course, was a folk singer who really married the idea of topical songs of the day and issues with traditional folk melodies. That's an important formula, because what Guthrie then will do was he'd go out to the Great Dust Bowl and he would see these people and he could see they were starving, they'd lost their homes and the banks had taken away their farms and all these things. And what he did about it was he put that into his music. And so he was a troubadour, really, an American troubadour, you can think of him. And of course, he would have a tremendous impact on Bob Dylan, because when Dylan comes to New York, he finds Guthrie in a hospital dying of Huntington's chorea, and he plays him songs. He wants the master's approval. So what Woody Guthrie did, way back in the 30s, now Bob Dylan would do in a new way in the 1960s, and that is, he takes civil rights, right? He take Medgar Evers or Emmett Till or whatever it happened to be and write about that, but put them to traditional folk melodies. So once again, it's a form that is very effective and very alive. This is Woody Guthrie, and this, of course, is the Great Dust Bowl.
The clouds look death like black, and through our mighty nation it left a dreadful track. From Oklahoma City to the Arizona line, Dakota and Nebraska to the lazy Rio Grande, it fell across our city like a curtain of black rolled down. We thought it was our judgment, we thought it was our doom.
This is American music. It's kind of like a wake-up call. It basically saying, as I could, you may not know this is going on, but this is the truth about what people are going through way out west. Duke Ellington, that's one of the giant of American music. Ellington was basically someone who, what Armstrong did for improvised music, Ellington did for composition in jazz and in popular music. He was a tireless writer. He had gone to art school, and I really think he took his art school attitude and applied it to music, because to him music was color. And so what he did with his band, and that distinguished band there, was, I think it's around 1934, they were a universal stars and treated very differently in Europe. Europe saw Duke Ellington as America's Mozart or Beethoven. Most people still in America knew the name Duke Ellington, but they saw him as a Negro dance band leader. So they were not ready to give him the kind of respect that he got when he went to Europe. That would come much, much later. But to me, Ellington is a great example of an artist that goes against the grain. You know, oftentimes when you listen to pop music today, it's no different today than it was back in the 30s. pretty much all pop music sounds the same, and that can be a complaint. All the singers sound alike, all the records sound like they're coming out of a faucet. You know, there's a sameness to it, you know. But there's always someone who goes the other way. So in the 1920s, if you wanted a gig, the way you got the gig was play what we call sweet band music. In other words, you played it very saccharine and very pop and very light without a lot of syncopation or heavy rhythm, because most white upper middle class audiences like that. Ellington didn't do that. Ellington played the sound of Harlem, the guttural sound of the way people sounded in the streets when they talked, or the sounds you heard in an elevator shaft, or the sound of a guy whistling as he crosses by your window. Ellington played the African American experience, but he realized that the African American experience was the American experience. He did not see himself as being separate from anybody else. So if you listen to this piece, it's not sweet, it's rough. And the reason why it's rough is because he has this trumpet player, Bubba Miley, playing plunger mute. You know what that is? It's a toilet plunger with the stick pulled out. And so it gets this, this guttural sound comes from the throat, and you get this rah sound. And Ellington, rather than saying, oh no, people won't like that, don't do that, he'd say, that's what I want. That's the color, that's what I want for my band. And this is the very famous East St. Louis Toodaloo. It gave Ellington a distinctive sound. He was not the most popular band, okay? Paul Whiteman sold a lot more records than Ellington, but now, here we are in 2018, and we know the name Paul Whiteman, but we talk about Duke Ellington because that was innovative. And so it is taking the road less traveled. That really is still what the arts are truly about. So, Boogie Woogie. All my students have heard Boogie Woogie. You know why? Because they've heard rock and roll. Boogie Woogie is the start of rock and roll, many people would say. It was popular in the Harlem Renaissance in the 1920s. Some people said it was a rhythm that you heard when trains crossed the tracks, that clacking kind of sound. And Boogie Woogie then is really, again, another form which later on it'll be Elvis Presley and Little Richard, but this is what it sounded like back in its early days. If you couldn't move to that, you were dead. You know? And no wonder. So you electrify it, right, by the 1950s, and you put a drummer behind it, and a bass player, and a keyboard player playing Boogie Woogie like a Jerry Lee Lewis, maybe an electric guitar. You got rock and roll, you know? So it's always seems like to us in America that something is brand new. It almost never is. It's always coming from the past forward. So to me, the seeds of the future are planted in the past. You plant those seeds in the 1920s, and then it's going to come up this way for Jerry Lee Lewis and Little Richard, but it's going to come up a different way for Jimi Hendrix and Eric Clapton later on. Everybody's going to take those seeds and do something very different with them. Okay, so we got to talk about Benny Goodman. In America, and I have to point out to my students, and you probably all know this, we lived in racial apartheid from 1894 until 1954. That meant that all facilities were separate, okay? Separate but equal, which was a euphemism. It never really was, of course, so we all know that. So what that meant was music was also segregated. Black bands or white bands, but never together. Maybe jamming at 3 o'clock in the morning when nobody was looking, but that was absolutely forbidden, okay? Benny Goodman is Jewish. He came from Chicago. He was his father was a tailor. They were not well off at all, but he was very proud of his son's ability to play the clarinet and did everything he could to make sure that he got the lessons that he needed. And so when Goodman came to New York City, he decided to put a band together. They went on the road. They had a radio show called Let's Dance, but the sponsor pulled out. So they went across the country in cars. And what Goodman had was a vision. He had a white band, but he had an admiration for black talent like Count Basie and Duke Ellington. And so he got black arrangers to write arrangements for him that gave his band the sound of a black band with a kind of aggressive drive, because that's as much as he could do. When he got to the Palomar Ballroom in California, he was about to give up because most of the ballrooms didn't get it. They didn't like it. Can't you boys play some foxtrots? In other words, they were behind the times, and they didn't like what Goodman was doing. But a young audience did. A young audience had been listening to those coast-to-coast broadcasts, and they wanted Benny Goodman to rock like he did on the radio. And so at the Palomar Ballroom, they said, oh, the heck with it, we'll just play the ones we want to play. And he became a superstar overnight. If you stop right there, you might say, well, he kind of stole it, didn't he? He kind of stole someone else's music. I don't think so. I don't think so, because what he did was he had the courage, through the prodding of his son-in-law, John Hammond, one of the great talent scouts of all time. He started to bring black musicians into his band and he ostensibly did what Branch Rickey did with Jackie Robinson for the Brooklyn Dodgers. He was such a superstar that he got away with it, and the audience, all they cared about was the music. They didn't care about that other stuff. So when we hear Benny Goodman, we hear not only an incredible artist, but someone who had the courage to do something in the late 30s that people hadn't done. You all know this one. Before, raise your hand. It's a staple of American music. You know what's amazing about that record to me? The bass drum. That is the loudest thing on that record. Now that is not the way people usually heard music back then. Usually the drums were way in the back and they were a light and they were accompaniment. But what the black bands did and what Goodman did was bring the drums right up here and make that more prominent than the clarinet, than the saxophone, than the trombones. And so that, to me, is a sign of the times. Because it means now rock and roll will take the drums also and put it up front. Hip-hop will take the drums and put it up front. In other words, the drums will become the most dominating factor of the music. Yes, we've got a singer. Yes, we've got all kinds of other stuff going on, but it's about the beat. And later in the 50s, they'll call that big beat. Remember that expression, big beat? Big beat was basically making a record now, but making the beat heavier than it had ever been before. But you can really go back to the 30s and see that Benny Goodman and bands like him were really already there. Frank Sinatra, wow. What can you say about probably the genius of American vocal music? He was a jazz singer. He became a pop singer and became a movie star, but he was a jazz singer. He learned by singing in Tommy Dorsey's band, and he phrased like a horn player. He really got a lot of his sound from Billie Holiday, because Holiday did the same thing. She phrased like an instrument. And so what the magnificence of Sinatra is the fact that no one can sing a melody like this guy. Whether you like him or not as a person, it has nothing to do with it. Nobody can phrase like this guy. So much so that even Miles Davis had to say, I got a lot of the way I play melodies from Frank Sinatra. And this is a great example of that.
In the wee small hours of the morning, while the whole wide world is fast asleep, you lie awake and think about the girl and never ever think of counting sheep.
Sounds easy? Just try it. That's the rubber band at its ultimate, you know? The way he's singing that melody, you couldn't get that out of anybody else but a Sinatra, someone who really knows how to work, not just sing the lyric, but get inside the lyric. That's a whole different kind of thing. And what a genius. But he could also swing like this.
It is only a paper moon sailing over a cardboard sea, but it wouldn't be make-believe if you believed in me. Yes, it's only a canvas sky hanging over a muslin tree, but it wouldn't be make-believe if you believed in me.
I worked with him in the 80s, and I'll tell you something, he was a master. I wouldn't want to mess with him, but he was a master at what he did. And he really admired Ella. And Ella is probably the quintessential jazz singer because she was someone who came from also a very rough background, but really, like a sponge, absorbed every band she ever played with. And so when she sang, she could make her voice be a trumpet or a trombone or a saxophone. In other words, she could mold her voice any way she wanted to. And what a genius.
If I should suddenly start to sing or stand on my head or anything, don't think that I've lost my senses. It's just that my happiness finally commences. The long, long ages of dull despair are turning into thin air, and it seems that suddenly I've become the happiest girl alive. Things are looking up. I've been looking the landscape over, and it's covered with four-leaf clover. Oh, things are looking up since.
You know, when I hear those records, that's really truth. That's the way she sounded, you know. There's no auto-tune on that. There's no splicing, there's no fixing, there's no ducking, there's no anything. That's what it was. And so I'm not anti-technology, don't get me wrong, but the records of this period really tells us a lot about the incredible artistry. These were one-take artists or two-take artists. Sinatra couldn't get it in 2 takes. He put his coat on and he went home. He said, I don't got it today. That's it, you know. Hank Williams, let's talk about country music. Country music is often misunderstood. I think it's obviously become very pop today, and that's a different kind of thing, I think. But what country music really did was it brought the lyrics forward and it told a story. It told a story about people in the South. I don't care who they were, but what the race they were, but people who had hard lives. And they needed someone to sing about those lives. And they needed to hear something come over the radio that basically said, yeah, I'm not alone. That's my life too. And Hank Williams was a master at telling that kind of story. And the importance of the lyric in country music is huge.
Your cheating heart will make you weep. You'll cry and cry and try to sleep, but sleep won't come
the whole night through. Your cheating heart will tell on you.
You know, the record industry creates a lot of stereotypes, and one of them is all black people sing blues and all the white people sing country music. It never was like that. Never like that. If you grow up in the South, you grow up generally in the same economic climate as people around you in your neighborhood, okay? So to grow up in Mississippi basically meant if you couldn't afford the rent in the higher level of the city, you basically went to school and shops with people of other races who were in the same economic bag as you. Okay, therefore, what it meant was to grow up in the South. Why does so much American music come from the South? And the reason is diversity, and the reason also is the very close proximity of people living cheek by jowl, as opposed to a place like Chicago, where I come from, where, you know, for many, many, many years, all the black people had to live on the south side of Michigan Avenue, and all the white people lived on the north side of Michigan Avenue. So we would have liked to have thought we were more, you know, advanced racially, and we weren't at all. As a matter of fact, even though the South obviously is very prejudiced, the fact is if you grew up in the South, you grew up in a rich musical landscape where everywhere there was gospel music coming out of churches, there was country music coming out of that barn over there. On the radio they played everything, country, rockabilly, blues, you know, everything. And so you got a saturation. That's why you had Elvis. Elvis couldn't have been born in Massachusetts. You know what I mean? I love Massachusetts. I'm not knocking it. But it couldn't happen there. It had to happen in an environment where it was simply in the air. You were permeated by it. And that's one of the reasons why so many of our great artists are Southern artists. This guy as well. Muddy Waters was a sharecropper in Mississippi. And he heard himself on a record down there, and he said, you know, I wish I could make it. And so he, like millions of other people, were part of the migration, right, from the South up to the North. And that started in 1919, and it wasn't really over until about 1960. Okay, and he came to Chicago from being a sharecropper, and he brought his acoustic guitar, and he started playing in clubs, and he realized, I'm not loud enough. You know, they're drunk, and they're noisy, and there's sirens outside. That lo and behold, the electric guitar is invented in the 1940s, and he plugs in. Not only does he plug in, he forms almost like what is a symphony orchestra, okay? It becomes the blues band. And the blues band of Muddy Waters then becomes the sound, the staple sound of what electric blues will sound like and what early rock will sound like as well. And what a master in Muddy Waters.
I'm ready, ready as anybody. I'm ready, ready as anybody. I am ready for you. I hope you're ready for me.
Now, I don't know if you people know what pop music sounded like in the 1950s, but it didn't sound like that. You know, it was Doris Day, and it was, you know, very like, how much is that doggy in the window, right? You know, and that was pop music because it was white, corporate-dominated music that you heard on the radio. That's not what was going on at the Checkerboard Lounge on the south side of Chicago, I could tell you that. It was rough and dangerous and edgy, and don't you know which band got their start by copying Muddy Waters? Do you know who they are? The Rolling Stones. The Rolling Stones copied Muddy Waters. Rolling Stones is a song by Muddy Waters. They basically used his record as a textbook, and they'd be the first people to tell you that. So once again, it's artists creating a form, okay? And that's what Muddy Waters did. And that form then resonated 3,000 miles away in England, where now English groups could take that and say, well, we're never going to be Muddy Waters, but we can write our own songs. Let's write a song called I Can't Get No Satisfaction, which is directly out of Chicago blues. So again, I think those connections really, really come through. This is a genius and a tragic figure of American music. Jazz changes post-war. The jazz musician from the 1900s to the 1940s, early 1940s, was an entertainer. Louis Armstrong was an entertainer. He was there to put on a show and make people feel good. And there's nothing wrong with that. Charlie Parker and the bebop movement in New York City was a different movement. They were young musicians who were bored. They were bored with the commercial constraints of swing, and they wanted to find, like, and explore new territory. Okay? And they did in a music called bop. Bop was a modern jazz sound that, for the first time, wasn't for a dancing audience. It wasn't commercial. It wasn't intended really to try to bring in a large audience. He changed our modern harmonic language. What I mean by that is he played notes Louis Armstrong never thought of. He played lines and ideas that no one had ever played in Duke Ellington's band before. So he was a pioneer. He was a drug addict. He died at the age of 35. It was a sad, many people make the analogy between Charlie Parker and Mozart. Brilliant minds that burned out way, way too fast. When you hear Charlie Parker, then, you really hear the sound of a new, modern, post-war America. Sometimes you create art that people don't understand. Even Beethoven wrote a piece once, and a guy said, "Maestro, I don't really understand this piece that you just wrote." And he said, "Of course you don't. It's for 50 years from now." It takes an audience a long time sometimes to catch up, you know. And when they do, then it's too late. It's for the artist, but it's not too late for the evolution of people, okay? And that certainly happened with Charlie Parker. This might be the first rock and roll record. It was recorded in 1951. The producer was Sam Phillips, the famous producer who discovered Elvis Presley, and it was called Rocket 88 because it was a car. It was an Oldsmobile that was souped up and fast and the coolest thing that a young college guy could have if he's going to pick up his date. And so Rocket 88 is basically the sound of the rough boogie-woogie sound I played for you earlier on, but now it's electrified, and now it's new.
You women have heard of jalopies, you've heard the noise they make, but let me introduce my new Rocket 88. Yes, it's straight, just one way. Everybody likes my Rocket 88. Baby, we'll ride in style, moving all along.
Now listen to the lyrics. That's a very different kind of lyric than what Sinatra was singing, right? Sinatra was singing to adults. He was singing about love. He was about people who had their hearts broken and they knew what he was singing about. This is a song about a car and taking your girl out in this car and driving fast. And that is a change mid-America that we never go back to. Okay, meaning great Tin Pan Alley composers wrote for adults. They wrote for people who already, you know, were well on the way into their lives and were getting married, and that was their story. This is not what rock and roll did. Rock and roll found its audience because TV was outdoing radio, and radio was going under in the 50s, and they needed a format, otherwise they were going out of business. And they found if we play these rhythm and blues records, we get phone calls from all over the country of kids who want to hear more of it. And so radio was not only the thing that was a catalyst for rock and roll, it also was a social equalizer, because you can't censor radio and you can't decide what race of people are going to listen to it. And so once you play, you know, great artists, it's no longer like, well, it can only be for this part of town or this section of town or this group of people. It's not that simple. And that's where someone like Little Richard comes through. Because Little Richard, I mean, talk about someone who's outrageous and ahead of his time. He's the one who encapsulates the rock and roll spirit personified. Kind of crazy, you know, kind of cross-dressing, kind of going over the edge, and that's what rock and roll did during the very conservative 50s, all right? You remember the McCarthy hearings. America was very conservative, and rock and roll came along at the absolute opposite end of the spectrum and basically said, we don't care about all that. We want to dance, we're young, we want to enjoy our lives, we want music that doesn't sound like our parents. And that's exactly what Little Richard gave them.
Wham bam loom bam 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 to the boot, oh root, 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 oh wham bam loom bam 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 bam.
It was pretty tough for a black performer back then because America was very segregated, and what you got on pop radio was not that, you got this.
Once I had a secret love.
Well, that makes Little Richard from another planet, I think. I mean, right? You know, come on, you know, that's a whole other thing. Sometimes the movies change music. Rock Around the Clock. Remember Blackboard Jungle? Blackboard Jungle had the first rock and roll soundtrack. And so now what you had was big speakers in a movie theater that were rattling and with volume. And people never heard that before because they listened to music on small speakers, transistor radios, car radios. They had never heard that sound before. And now suddenly rock and roll was a sensory experience.
1, 2, 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock, rock. 5, 6, 7 o'clock, 8 o'clock, rock. 9, 10, 11 o'clock, 12 o'clock, rock. We're going to rock around the clock tonight. Put your glad rags on. Join me home. We'll have some fun when the clock strikes 1. We're going to rock around the clock tonight. We're going to rock, rock, rock till broad daylight. We're going to rock around the clock tonight.
This guy was a genius. And he lived only a very, very short life. He died in a plane crash. Buddy Holly. Buddy Holly was a visionary, okay? He changed the sound of rock and roll, first of all, by a couple of things. One, he got away from the saxophone, boogie-woogie piano, and he made guitars the feature of his group. Guitar, lead guitar, rhythm guitar, bass, drums. The exact instrumentation of the Beatles. Beatles, Buddy Holly and the Crickets, get it? Crickets, Beatles, okay? Even McCartney said our first 40 songs were basically Buddy Holly. He was an incredible songwriter, and he realized something before I think anyone else did. The future is in the recording studio, and it's the way you use the recording studio. Before then, most people had gone into a recording studio and just played like they played live, not Buddy Holly. He spent months making records. He used echo. He used bouncing tracks back and forth, overdubbing his voice. He was way ahead of his time. So long before the Beatles did that with George Martin, and long before Brian Wilson did that with the Beach Boys with Pet Sounds, Buddy Holly was doing it in the 1950s. When you listen to a Buddy Holly record, even though it was recorded in the 50s, it doesn't sound that way. It sounds like it could have been recorded last week.
Well, alright, so I'm being foolish. Well, alright, let people know about the dreams and wishes you wish in the night when lights are low. Well,
Another visionary who gave us a form, and so did Chuck Berry. I love what John Lennon once said. They never should have called it rock and roll, they should have called it Chuck Berry. Because nobody epitomized the sound of rock and roll like this guy with his distorted guitar, his showmanship, and his incredible lyrics. He was an incredible lyricist. And so what you got with Chuck Berry was a guy who was well into his 30s, but he knew how to write to the American teenager. He knew how to write to their hopes and dreams and their aspirations. And to this day, there's still really nobody quite like him. And of course, everybody knows at least one Chuck Berry song like this one. that's like the rock national anthem. I mean, I go to countries where, people don't speak any language and they want to jam, and that's the song that they play. Elvis Presley. Now, there's a guy who's probably one of the most misunderstood guys of the 20th century. Who was he? We don't really know. It's shrouded in so much hyperbole and mysticism that it's very hard to get at this guy. But we do know the fact that he was a great singer, a great performer, someone who had absorbed black music in Mississippi and then Memphis thoroughly. He really knew his stuff. Okay, he had a very troubled life. He was the first rock superstar. Too much, too fast. To be a multimillionaire at 21 is not something that anybody was ready for, and particularly a guy who barely got out of high school like Elvis. But what Elvis had was the ability not to invent rock and roll, because that had come long before him. What he did is that he basically was exactly what his record producer said. If I could find a white man who could sing like a black man, I could make $1 billion. But it's got to be a white man who really knows how to do it, and really knows how to do it with a black impact. And that's exactly what Elvis did.
Train I ride, 16 coaches long. Train I ride, 16 coaches long. While that long black train got my baby and gone.
That was the real Elvis in the early days. This is a genius of American music, Ray Charles. What did Ray Charles do? Everything. There was nothing he couldn't do. He was not only just an incredible soul singer, he was a gospel singer, he was an incredible jazz musician, great arranger, great composer, record producer, and a blind man. And so he really never let anything get in his way. And there are so many singers that I can think of today who basically come out of Ray Charles in the style of singing. Rod Stewart, Joe Cocker, then all on and on and on. They're really coming out of Ray Charles. And he was, as Sinatra called him, one of the few geniuses in music.
Coffee in my favorite cup. That's why I know. Yes, I know. Hallelujah. I just love.
Hallelujah is the key word there, because what he did was he took gospel music and he made it secular. He changed my God to my baby. In other words, he put the pulpit on the bandstand is what he did. And as a result, black gospel music, which had always been around since the 20s, now became rhythm and blues. It now became, in the 1960s, soul music. So it was the message of God, but now if the lyrics changed, now you could talk about your girlfriend. Now you could talk about your life outside of church. Miles Davis, there's a visionary of the second half of the 20th century, seemed to be like a chameleon. He always sort of knew what to do next to push music. And there are so many Miles Davis records that it's really hard to describe which one, because they're all a different person in a way. There's a lot of trumpet players out there who are a lot better players than Miles Davis, but there's nobody who phrases like this guy. This record, Kind of Blue, is one of the classics. Many people would say it might be the greatest jazz record ever recorded. That might be a little bit too much, but the fact is, it just shows how art appreciates over time. This record comes out in 1959. It sells about 2,000 copies. You know how many copies it sold by 2018? About 7 million, 7 or 8 million. Why? Because people recognized, just like they recognize a Picasso or a Jean-Michel Basquiat, it appreciates over time in a way that commodities do not. Dylan, well, a lot's been said about Dylan lately, right? Okay, and here's a guy who basically, I think, picked up the mantle from Woody Guthrie. And in the 60s, even though he didn't like being called a protest singer on Masters of War, it's very clear that this guy has a raging anger and can put it into music.
Come, you masters of war, here to build the big guns, here to build the death planes, here to build all the bombs, here to hide behind walls, here to hide behind discs. I just don't want you to know I can see through your mask.
You know, a writer said he thought that the greatest accomplishment of Bob Dylan really is his invention of himself. He invented Bob Dylan. In other words, he's a Jewish guy from Minnesota, came to New York, changed his name, and shrouded himself in mysticism, and we still don't really know who he is after all this time. And there's something very attractive and interesting about that. I'm going to skip over to Aretha. Aretha took a song by a man and made it a woman's anthem. And what an incredible artist, a voice of a century, Aretha Franklin. But the way she sings Respect is from a woman's perspective in 1967. And she takes a man's song and completely takes and gives it an anthem quality for a different group.
All of us here at Fillmore West, this is a long-awaited privilege and a great pleasure to bring on the #1 lady, Miss Aretha.
This is one of the hottest records I've ever heard in my life. Aretha live at the Fillmore. It doesn't get any better than that. The level of the playing, the level of the singing, the electricity of the music. Phew, wow. We don't really hear that very often anymore, and I just think that it's something that we really need to kind of remember. I'm going to skip around a little bit if I may. James Brown, let's talk about James Brown. This is a genius of rhythm. And in a very interesting, controversial life, James Brown changed our beat. So just like Armstrong changed our beat in jazz, right? He changed our beat in what we now call funk. Matter of fact, he's the most sampled artist in hip-hop today, taking 4 bars of a James Brown record and sampling over it and then rapping over it becomes someone else's record. He was a genius at the groove, at getting instruments to fit together like this, okay? And so it's not about the lyrics. Sometimes you can't even tell what he's singing. It's half rapping, it's grunting, it's all these kinds of things. It's a different kind of delivery. At the time when the Beatles are singing Eleanor Rigby and Yesterdays and all that, he's doing something completely different. And this is an anthem. So that sound then becomes modernized by the time you get to the late 70s, early 80s, and you have Grandmaster Flash, one of the geniuses of turntables, who now is going to be able to take those beats and with an MC, with a rapper, put them in a whole other kind of domain. So funk evolves and becomes this. It beat's not that far away from what you just heard, but it's got a techno quality to it. It breathes and moves air in a totally different way than what we had before. All right, so Mr. Hotshot Professor Torff, what do you do about all this? All right, so I have this band, as Jackie mentioned, and I'm a songwriter, and I'm going to play an example of, in a way, my, I guess, commentary a little bit on something that Bruce Springsteen wrote and said in a speech. Actually, he said, we live in a post-authentic world. You know, we live in a world of smoke and mirrors where there's a lot of hype and a lot of marketing and a lot of, you know, manipulation out there. And so I tried to come up with a song for my band, New Duke, that would basically have a lyric that would maybe talk about how far we've come from the Chuck Berry days to where we are now. And I'll play just a little bit of it for you if you'd like, and this is called Post-Authentic World.
Crazy, crazy business back in 54. Someone let the genie out of the bottle. Music opened a forbidden door. Rocket 80 Eagle throttle. So I asked a fortune teller on the street, pulling out $1 from my vest. She said there's magic in between the beats. What happens next is anybody's guess. We're living in a post-authentic world. Everyone knows it's true. Maybe it's a post-authentic world. What's a poor boy to do?
Thank you. What are we to do? Well, we keep creating. And we create regardless of what is popular and what the media says we should do. And we basically try to follow our own direction because it's the only thing that we can do with authenticity. So just a mention over on the table there, I have some postcards. I've written a book about my experience working with people like Frank Sinatra and Errol Garner and Mary Lou Williams, and so that information is there. And also, if you'd like to get on my mailing list, I do a lot of performances. I'll be playing here with a trio, as Jackie said, in April. But that band that you just heard will be touring this summer. I know we're going to do some summer concerts in Connecticut, so if you'd like to get on our email list, I promise we won't bother you and just make a few announcements. And, you know, I think the great thing about American music is and that's some of the lyrics of the tune, it brings people together. And it looks different today. You know, the way people dance, the way they dress, everything has changed. And it should change, because that's how we evolve. But some things stay the same. And so we still have the fascination around the jukebox. We don't have many jukeboxes anymore, but we're still drawn to music. It's still powerful. It still has a big impact on our lives at any age. And that couple there on the famous Woodstock poster, that music drew them together, they're still married after all these years. Thank you so much.